Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today I just wanted to talk about the books that I've been reading this week. And it's been a fun one. I'm very much in the midst of prizes, as you'll see, but I've managed to read a few books that are not prizes as well, which has been a delight. So with that, let's get started. First up, I read Split Tooth by Tanya Tagaq. And this is a book that is an author who I'd had my eye on for a little bit, partly as well because she also is a musician and I kind of kept on seeing things about her music as well. But this essentially is a book that kind of had come back up and I'd sort of seen, I bought a bit ago just sort of on a whim and then was like, right, I'm actually going to finally read it. And it's a really interesting and very brutal, very difficult read in many ways as well. The core focus of this is sort of this character who's also sort of the narrator, the writer themselves, talking about some pretty gritty things, particularly around sort of childbirth, around violence, around sort of quite a few things that are quite. It's not easy, a lot of this book, and so we start sort of from quite a young age of her as a young woman at school. The young girl kind of then going to school, turning into a young woman, and particularly a lot of the kind of conversation she has at the time with these young boys who are trying to sort of get with her in some way. But then the book kind of keeps moving forward and we sort of see a bit of her adult life and particularly some really brutal, horrible things happening to her. She's also a First Nations woman in Canada. And so there's a lot also in there about kind of the politics of sort of reservations and sort of the way that Indigenous folk in Canada are kind of treated, and it all kind of comes together to make this quite difficult book. It has sort of little fractions, sort of parts of this book will kind of go into little bits of poetry, or kind of almost spoken word kind of style things. Others are sort of a bit more direct kind of prose. It sort of does quite a lot within its pages. It's quite a difficult one. At times I think I found it a bit, there was almost so much going on that I don't think I could really sort of focus on parts of it, but I also think there's a lot in here that's really vital and really powerful as well. Next up, I read Names for the Sea, Strangers in Iceland by Sarah Moss. So I was recently on holiday in Iceland and I'd requested this book from the library to take with me while I was there. And it only really arrived after I'd already left. But it was kind of fun reading it afterwards and kind of re-engaging with some of the places that she mentioned in this book. So Sarah Moss, otherwise a novelist, writes in this book of sort of non-fiction her sort of story of being living in Iceland for a while and her attempts to sort of familiarize herself with the culture and sort of to fit in. And so fitting in for her was sort of trying to understand Icelandic culture around her. But also she's there at quite pivotal moments. She's there sort of a bit after the sort of the banks, the sort of major issues with the banking sector, around the time of the volcano eruption. Loads of things are happening kind of in and around the time that she's in Iceland. And that really affects her ability to sort of be there. But I think what's really powerful is just the way that she writes sort of not only what is basically a history of parts of Iceland or the kind of modern history of Iceland, and sort of her attempts to sort of fit in with its culture, but there's also a profound sort of loneliness in this book. And in many ways, Iceland is a country that I think, because of its very bleak and very open landscapes, really lends itself to loneliness in quite a beautiful way. But also we see, for her, this sort of struggle of trying to make ends meet in this country where she always feels a bit like an outsider. And particularly where her sort of cost of living is very different. So she feels like she's only really eking out an existence all the time that she's there, which can be incredibly difficult and sort of grinding on her. And then I just thought this was really beautifully done. And yeah, I just really enjoy Sarah Moss anyway. So this was a great way of experiencing this. It's not all doom and gloom in this book, but it kind of goes into a few of those sort of darker moments too. Next up, on a very different note, I read Mr. Loverman by Bernardine Evaristo. And I'd been meaning to read this for ages and just kept on sort of not really getting around to it. But Mr. Loverman essentially tells a love story between two older Caribbean men in the UK. And what is sort of really quite fun about this is, she very much keeps the voices of that. These are sort of men from the Windrush generation, basically, sort of a group of people from from the Caribbean who moved to the UK at a very specific point in history as a sort of post-war rebuilding in the UK, and often were treated actually very badly, as we sort of, particularly a lot of historical documents have been coming out about this in recent years. And what is so interesting, I think, in this book is, she's telling this love story between two men who, typically when we see sort of, I suppose, gay romances, or romance is maybe not the word for this, but when we see sort of gay couples represented in fiction, they typically tend to be younger, white, and sort of of the local country, right? Whereas it's something quite interesting to see these two men who are older, who are from the Caribbean, just sort of navigating that. And there are some really deliciously fun and silly moments, particularly as it sort of pertains to the current partner, the sort of wife of one of the central men, where we sort of get a feeling all the way through that he's sort of playing this sort of role of like, oh, it's just sort of been a bit naughty, just sort of stayed married to her for 50 years and like, whatever. And actually the way the book handles that, I think later on, is quite interesting, that sort of there's some, without spoiling anything, there's some degree of resolution about what their marriage actually looks like. And I think it's really fun. I'm really glad I finally read this after so long. It was a much more joyous read compared to some of the other things I've been reading recently. So this is good fun. And I think it does quite a lot to sort of explore that kind of territory. I think Bernardine Evaristo has a sort of very good ear for dialect and for dialogue, and there's something about the way that she sort of picks up these it feels very much like, you're sat down in front of your grandpa and he's telling you a story. It's very much that kind of feel as well, which I really appreciated. Next up, and so this is where we get into a little bit of prize territory. So I have been reading a few more Booker books, and part of that, it sort of started with reading the sort of background of the trilogy. So neither of these two books I'm about to mention were themselves shortlisted for the Booker, but the third in the series was, and that's the one I'm currently reading. So Roddy Doyle had the Barrytown trilogy, sort of The Commitments being the first book, then The Snapper, and then The Van, which is the one I'm reading now, and the one that was shortlisted for the Booker. But I kind of felt like, because it's the last book in a trilogy, I sort of wanted to read the other two first. And The Commitments and The Snapper both sort of focus around a similar sort of area of sort of Barrytown and this sort of set of family, these sort of families, sort of similar characters between books. The Commitments is mostly focused around it was turned into a film as well, but the Commitments is turned around a sort of local set of people who want to sort of make a band, and their kind of attempts to kind of make it. The audiobook for this is actually is a bizarre listen, because there are so many song parts added in that the audiobook narrator has to sing some of these songs, but intentionally sing some of them with like specific sort of passion. So at one point it is, sort of walking along listening to an audiobook, and it's 30 seconds of someone yelling out a chorus of a song. It's good fun. And so, yeah, that book sort of largely focuses around those characters, and it's just hilarious and really silly. The Snapper sort of picks up on some of that absurdity, and particularly is focused around one of the family who is pregnant, and the rest of the family is basically trying to work out who the father is, and it just sort of turns into this farcical, silly thing of, people sort of trying to ask the right questions or find out the right kind of information, and it's just a wild ride. Both of them are quite short books, but they are just very packed with sort of humor and silliness, and very much capturing the voice of the characters. So I'm excited for The Van to see what that does as well. On a significantly less cheery note, Carry Me Down by M.J. Hyland. This was also shortlisted for the Booker, I think in 2006, if I remember off the top of my head. And this sort of concerns a young boy who is, in some ways, a sort of early sort of savant kind of character. He's got this sort of what he sees as this ability to see if people are lying. He believes that he can tell if somebody is lying, and he does this by picking up on the signs from them. And there's various sort of psychologists throughout the book pick him up on. They're like, well, but these people are your family, so their tells better than other people might. But still, I just thought this was really well done. He's very much that kind of archetypal strange kid who is on the outskirts of everything. So, outside looking in, believes he can tell when people are lying. He spends all of his days reading the Guinness Book of Records, and he's sort of almost this weirdly stunted. His growth is almost stunted in that respect. He's like 5'10" at like 11 or 12 years old, so he's very, very tall, and a lot of people are very concerned about that. But he's also emotionally seemingly fairly immature. And so he just sort of lives in this very odd existence of sort of being a complete outsider for most of the book. But I just think this makes really beautiful in the way that he's portrayed in this sort of outsider status. He's sort of allowed to be someone who kind of sees the world for what it is. And, you know, it's I don't think it's any coincidence that he's intentionally the character who's given the ability of being able to tell when people are lying, because so much of his life is trying to decode these things around him. At one point he sees something happening in the home and everyone sort of, you know, says to him, like, you didn't see that, that's not real, you know, stop being so silly. And he's convinced that he did see it. And we as the reader kind of have to follow his lead on this, while also often treating him with some degree of skepticism, because we know that there are some moments where he's 11 or 12. He might have misread something that's happening. Kind of, if you think of the book Atonement, with something similar, with a character very much seeing the wrong thing or misunderstanding something. It's that same kind of idea at times in this book, which I thought was really, really, really well handled as well. And last but not least, I was recently at the event for the Republic of Consciousness Prize sort of winner announcement. And so the Republic of Consciousness Prize, there's a UK one and there's one for North America. And the UK one is basically, well, both of them are individually for the local, for sort of small and indie presses, and I'm particularly looking for quite daring fiction that's quite innovative, that's quite sort of groundbreaking in various ways. And so I finished reading some of the shortlist for that, and these two books I thought especially were really profound in many ways. So the first being Out of Earth by Sheyla Smanioto, translated by Laura Garmeson and Sophie Lewis. And they read an extract at this event as well, which just reminded me just how powerful this book is. It's 4 generations of women in Brazil, and particularly in quite a rural area of Brazil that's kind of a bit out of the way. It's a bit more it's kind of almost a slightly, you know, it's so far away from some of the big cities, and what we get is this really beautiful, very almost chant-like narrative style of somebody sort of going through their thoughts, and just sort of these young women, these women more broadly in the book, talking about their lives. And, you know, this is a life of hard existence. It's, you know, grinding poverty often, you know, not much is growing in this sort of agricultural area. It's hard, it's brutal, and I think the cover of the book kind of speaks to that with the vultures. But I think what's really well done in this book is just how it kind of maintains that narrative sharpness in such a gorgeous way. I think this is such a brilliant bit of writing, and it's also kind of a voice that we, I suppose, often when things are translated, we don't necessarily, you know, we tend to get kind of sort of certain narratives kind of come through, and actually maybe we don't often get as many narratives like this of a young working class woman in Brazil from quite a rural and quite a remote area, sort of talking about the hardships of their lives as well. Last but not least, also from the Republic of Consciousness shortlist, we have Avenues by Train by Farai Mudzingwa, and he is a Zimbabwean author who, this is a really, I mean, again, sort of that narrative. I'm a sucker for a strong narrative style, and I think this book does this really well. We see a young boy right at the beginning of the book who observes some really horrific things happen, and when all of that happens, it sort of fundamentally changes how he then approaches the rest of his life. He thinks he's haunted. He thinks his whole life is this sort of curse. And then what sort of follows from this is this very sort of mystical book that just sort of explodes with ideas and with things. And again, keeps this strong narrative style that's very brutal and matter of fact, but also plays around and can be quite beautiful and lyrical. I just thought this was really interesting as well. And really great to see, like another, you know, this is again where I think indies really are holding up half the sky, because they just do incredible things like this, that I think you know, a more mainstream publisher might think twice about maybe doing or taking up. But yeah, really, really incredible book, I think, as well. So those have been the books that I've read this week. I hope you're having a really good week. And yeah, take care and speak to you all very soon. Have a wonderful time. Bye-bye.